Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be talking about my favourite classics that I read in 2024. So I made a video last week talking about my favourite modern books, so mostly books from the 21st century that I read in 2024, but today I thought I would talk about some of my favourite classics that I've read this year. So I have a sort of top 10 classic novels that I read for the first time this year. I also have a few plays I want to talk about, and I also have a few rereads I want to talk about. So we'll start off with my sort of top 3 rereads of the year. When I say a favourite reread, I tend to mean a book that has gone up a lot in my estimation, or where I've got an awful lot out of a reread in particular, rather than just a book that I absolutely love that I happened to reread this year. So for example, I reread Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen and Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens this year, both of which are two of my absolute favourite novels of all time, like top 5, but I have reread them like 8+ times. So while every reread that I ever do of those two books is a glorious experience, I wouldn't necessarily count them as like a favourite reread of the year. They're just like a forever favourite. But there are a few books I've reread this year that were either sort of my second read or my third read of a book where they have gone up a lot in my estimation. So those are the books I want to talk about. But one of which is And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. So I first read this several years ago and really loved it. But I reread this earlier this year and I listened to it on audiobook actually, and I listened to it with my husband Nick. We both really like Agatha Christie and we've been listening to the Poirot books in publication order, but we thought we would have a change and listen to And Then There Were None. And there were so many great things about rereading this book. One, just there's something really satisfying about reading a really clever mystery and spotting clues, but also it was really fun to read it with Nick, who absolutely loved it as well, and that was just really nice. So this was definitely a highlight reread of the year. And Then There Were None is a novel from 1939 about 10 people who are summoned to a mysterious island. All of them have been given slightly strange reasons for being here, and when they arrive there they realise that they've all been brought here because all of them have been in some way responsible for somebody's death in the past, and they've been brought to this island to be punished, and one by one they start to be picked off. It is such a fantastic novel. The characterization, the mysteries, and everything within it, it's just incredible, and I think it is just probably Agatha Christie's best book and such an incredible novel. And I loved it the first time I read it, but I just loved it even more on a reread, so definitely a highlight reread this year. Then this year, one of Charles Dickens's Christmas books that I reread was The Haunted Man and the Ghost Bargain. And I'd read The Haunted Man once or twice before, and I had kind of remembered that I thought it was my second favourite Dickens Christmas book after A Christmas Carol, but I don't think I had remembered just how good it was. And rereading it again this year, listening to it on audiobook actually, was such a wonderful experience. This is one of Dickens's Christmas novellas, and it tells a story of this man, Redlaw, who is really struggling. He's haunted metaphorically by the grief he feels over the death of his sister, and he's haunted literally by a phantom figure of himself who is watching him and offers him a deal. The phantom says, "You can forget all the sorrow and suffering of your life. If you like, I will take those memories from you." And Redlaw accepts, and we follow what happens from that point onwards. And it's just really fantastic. So that was another reread highlight this year. And then my favourite reread of the year, and definitely just one of my favourite reads of the year in general, was The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens. Again, I actually listened to this on audiobook. I generally reread on audiobook rather than physically. And I just thought this was incredible. I love The Mystery of Edwin Drood so very much. This is Charles Dickens's last novel, incomplete novel. He was writing it when he died. He got exactly halfway through the planned serialized parts, and then he passed away. So we will never ever know what happened to Edwin Drood. In this novel, we're following various characters in the cathedral city of Cloisterham, including Edwin Drood, his fiancée Rosa, although they have been kind of engaged since they were kids, really, and they don't really know how they feel about it anymore. We're also following Edwin's uncle Jasper, two siblings who arrive in the neighbourhood from what was then Ceylon, what's now Sri Lanka, and various other characters. And one day Edwin Drood vanishes, and as I said, we will never ever know what happened to him because Dickens didn't finish the book. I have my own theories. I made a very long video about The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which I'll leave linked down below, but I just think this is an incredible novel. Our Mutual Friend by Charles Dickens is my favourite book of all time, and my favourite book by my favourite author, and Our Mutual Friend was the novel before The Mystery of Edwin Drood, so that was the last completed novel that Dickens finished before his death. And I think that if he'd finished The Mystery of Edwin Drood, it would be my favourite book of all time. Like, I think it would beat Our Mutual Friend trend for me. But it's not finished, so it can't, but it's so good. It's so good. I understand why a lot of people don't want to read half a book, but also what a great half a book it is. So that was amazing. I read some really fantastic classic plays this year, so I thought I'd give you a top 3. At number 3, we have Trelawney of the Wells by Arthur Wynne Pinheiro. This is a late Victorian farce from 1898 about a young couple who have got engaged, and she has formerly been an actress, but she's going to give up her career on the stage in order to marry this young man who's from a very respectable family. And before they get married, it's been agreed that she's going to go and live with his relations for a little while to get herself used to the kind of polite world outside of the theatrical world. And things go on from there in a very entertaining, wondrous manner. It is a very, very fun play, which is really all about kind of a clash between theatrical communities and non-theatrical communities, and how kind of within the Victorian period, within the theatre, a lot of the sort of regular social rules didn't apply in the same way, and therefore people who have worked in the theatre just have a very like different outlook towards life. It's just a really fun play that I really, really enjoyed. Really like Arthur Wynne Pinheiro a lot, and this is great fun. At number 2, I have Lael Sur by Michael Tremblay. This is a Canadian play, a French-Canadian play translated from the French to the English by John Van Burek and Bill Glasgow. This is a wonderful, wonderful play. So this is from 1965, and it follows various characters, chiefly focusing on a group of women after one woman has kind of like won a lot of tokens in a raffle. That's not exactly what it is. It's something to do with stamps. And we're following various women, some who are middle-aged, some who are younger, and we look at kind of generational clash, the position of women at this point in time, sort of how the 1960s are changing things, but only for certain groups of people. It's a play about class and gender and generational conflict, and the staging of it is really clever because a lot of the time we're seeing kind of a scene between a lot of different women, and then the spotlight will kind of shine on one of them, and she will kind of have a monologue for a few pages, and then we'll kind of return to the scene. And that's just a really like effective way of getting to see into the heads of all of these very, very different people, and I just loved it so much. It's such a wonderful, wonderful play that I just really can't recommend enough. I thought it was fantastic. So yes, another highlight of 2024. But my top play of 2024, one of my favourite classics of the year, was A Portrait of the Artist as Filipino by Nick Joaquin. So I read this play in a bind-up of various of his works. The edition is called The Woman Who Had Two Navels and Tales of the Tropical Gothic, and it's mostly short stories and one play. And I didn't really love the short stories at all, so this book as a whole thing is not a favourite of the year, but the play was amazing. So A Portrait of the Artist as Filipino is a play from 1950. It's set in the very early 1940s, when World War II has started, but it hasn't come to the Philippines yet, which kind of adds this like layer of impending doom and danger across the whole play in a really effective way. And the play is about two sisters who live with their father in this sort of crumbling house. They don't really have enough money to keep it going anymore, and the one thing they have of value is this painting by their father called A Portrait of the Artist as Filipino. And again, the idea is that this play is really cleverly staged. So the portrait is on the fourth wall, as it were. When the characters are looking at the portrait, they're actually looking out to the audience. The audience never see what the portrait looks like, which is, I just think, really clever, because of the way everyone talks about the portrait and how like a controversial painting it is. We're basically following the crumbling fortunes of this family. It has a real like Chekhov vibe to it. If you like Chekhov, I think you'll really like A Portrait of the Artist as Filipino. And it's just a fantastic play. Like, the characterization is fantastic. The writing is so good. It's just like really, really top quality drama. So I really, really recommend that a lot, and so glad that I read this year. But now onto my top 10 classic novels of the year. At number 10, I have a children's classic, The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper. So I read the first two books in this series, Oversea Under Stone and The Dark is Rising this year, but I think The Dark is Rising is probably my favourite of the two. I'm not really sure. In a way, this book is here to kind of stand in for both the books in the series that I've read so far. The Dark is Rising was published in 1973, and although it is a sequel, although it is a second book in a series, it is fairly standalone. There's a recurring secondary character and kind of a recurring threat, I suppose, but the sort of protagonist, the child we're following, is a different person from the first book in the series. In The Dark is Rising, we're following Will, who is, I think, 11 or 12 years old, and just before Christmas, his world starts to change. Mysterious things start to happen, and he suddenly becomes aware that he may have some kind of supernatural ability and that he may need to use that ability to save the world that he knows. It's such a fun children's book and it works really well. It's also very festive and Christmassy, which is fun. And there's a real clever play with time and history in it in a way that I just thought really, really worked. So I really recommend that series by Susan Cooper, and I'm looking forward to reading on with it. At number 9, I have a Victorian classic, The Perpetual Curet by Margaret Oliphant. This is one of Margaret Oliphant's Carlingford Chronicles. I think I just have one book left to read in this series now, and I've really enjoyed it so far. It's a series of interconnected novels set kind of in the same town but following different characters. In this book, we're following Frank Wentworth, who is a perpetual curate in Carlingford. He doesn't have much money. He doesn't have much hope of advancement. He's in love with a young woman called Lucy who he wants to marry, but he knows that he just doesn't have enough money to support her, and his only chance of getting a living and becoming a vicar or a rector and, you know, progressing as a clergyman is a living that is in the gift sort of his aunts, and his aunts are all very low church and he is very high church, so there's a lot of church politics in here, but also a lot of sort of family division. And when rumours and scandals kind of come to Carlingford, they start to threaten Frank's reputation, and it's just a really wonderful, fantastic book. I really like Margaret Oliphant. I love the way she writes, and this was just so enjoyable. In general, I really recommend Margaret Oliphant, and I recommend her Carlingford Chronicles. I would recommend reading them in order. This book is from later on in the series, but in general, I just think she's a really wonderful writer, and this was a great book. Sticking with the Victorians, at number 8, I have Linda Trestle by Anthony Trollope. This is a short, intense, fantastic book by Anthony Trollope. I don't know that I would necessarily recommend it for everyone, and I think if you really like Anthony Trollope, you might not love Linda Trestle because it doesn't do a lot of the same things that his books normally do. Like, usually Anthony Trollope is a comfort read for me, but there is nothing comforting about Linda Trestle. It is quite dark and intense and oppressive, but it's really fantastic. So Linda Trestle tells a story of a young woman called Linda who is living in Germany. She lives with her aunt, who is very strictly religious, and her aunt decides that it would be a good idea for Linda to marry their lodger, who is 30 years Linda's senior. Linda desperately doesn't want to marry Peter. In fact, there's someone else that she's in love with, but her aunt decides it would be good for Linda to marry this man, and that Linda ought to do her duty and obey her. And basically what follows is 200 pages of Linda's aunt and Peter trying to pressure Linda into marrying Peter, and it's so intense and so horrible, but it's really, really powerful and really well done, and it's just an exceptional novel. Like I said, not a usual Anthony Trollope, quite a different one for him, but it's a really fantastic book. More Victorians. At number 7, I have The Christmas Hirelings by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This is a wonderful Christmas novella by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Nothing like her usual sensation novels. This is a story of a baronet who is spending Christmas with his niece and a friend, and his niece is grown up, and the friend and the niece are saying, well, it's not really Christmas, is it, without any children? Nothing feels really festive without any children in the house. And then the friend says, well, why don't I go and hire some children to come and spend their Christmas in this big grand country estate, in this big mansion. They'll have a lovely time having more food and presents than they usually get, and we'll have a lovely time because there'll be children in the house brightening everything up. And the baronet kind of reluctantly agrees, and then these 3 little children come to the house and slowly melt the ice of the baronet's heart, and it's just lovely. It's just so lovely. I just really, really loved The Christmas Hirelings. It's also very short, like it's a novella. I think I listened to the audiobook and it's less than 4 hours. It won't take you long, and it's delightful. It is obviously quite Christmassy, so, you know, maybe save it for next year, but I loved it so much and I thought it was wonderful, and I know it's one I'll be rereading many Christmases to come. We're still on the Victorians. I read many classics this year that weren't Victorian, but what can I say? The Victorians always reign supreme. At number 6, I have Wilder's Hand by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. I think I read this way back in sort of January 2024, and I just thought it was wonderful. I love J. Sheridan Le Fanu. I think he's a fantastic writer of really intriguing, mysterious novels, and Wilder's Hand is no exception. This book kind of begins with this big family feud between these two families, and then Mark Wilder one of the members of this family. He's about to make a marriage with someone from the other family that his family's been feuding with, which will kind of mend the feud, when one day he vanishes. He sends letters saying he's gone abroad, but no one has seen him for a long time, and things start to feel strange and mysterious, and everything goes on from there. We follow a lot of different characters in this book. It's told in the first person, but through a sort of weirdly omniscient first-person narrator who sometimes will just be like, I wasn't here for this, but I can tell you what happened because someone told me about it later, which is quite an odd narrative style, but I kind of liked it. I went with it. And I just really, really enjoyed every minute of this. It's adventurous, it's mysterious, it's atmospheric, it is a Victorian sensation novel doing all the things that I love Victorian sensation novels to do, and I just really recommend it. So Wilder's Hand was another highlight of 2024. Stepping away from the Victorians for a few books, at number 5, I have Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie. Didn't actually read this edition, I listened to this on audiobook. As I mentioned earlier on in the video, me and Nick have been working our way through Poirot in publication order, and we listened to Death on the Nile a few months ago and just both absolutely loved it. It's such an incredible Agatha Christie novel. Like, it's interesting when you're reading your way through Agatha Christie, there are certain books that are just a lot more famous than other ones, and often you get to them and you're like, oh yes, I can see why this is so much more famous than many other Agatha Christie books. It's just top quality Poirot. So in Death on the Nile, we're following Hercule Poirot. He's on his holidays and he's on a boat going down the Nile with various other Europeans and some Americans. He is aware that there is some trouble brewing. There is a young woman who has come on this holiday following her former fiance and his new wife. She is not happy about the situation. She has been following them, and her former fiance's new wife is also a very wealthy heiress, so there's kind of lots of tension around her anyway. Lots of people really don't like her, and then of course someone dies because it's an Agatha Christie book and Poirot has to work out what happened, and it's just really, really, really good. There is a reason why this is one of her most famous books. It is great. And number 4, I have Nolly Me Tanger by Jose Rizal. This novel was first published in 1887 in the Philippines. It was originally published in Spanish, and the edition I read was translated by Harold Oderbrom. This is a book to read, I would say, if you love Alexander Dumas and Victor Hugo. It's a revolutionary social critique novel about a young man of mixed Spanish and Filipino heritage who returns to the Philippines after studying abroad. He returns to find that his father is dead and that his father died in prison and disgrace, and he begins to unpick how this happened and to discover a lot of corruption amongst Spanish friars within the Catholic Church in the Philippines. This is a book about corruption and imperialism and injustice, and it's so good. It's so powerful and so fantastic, and just really blew me away. It is quite a slow read. Like, it's not a hugely long book, but it took me a really long time just because it's quite dense and there was a lot to learn, and sometimes I would find myself sort of looking things up as I was reading it, but I just thought it was amazing. I just thought it was so fantastic and incredible, and I'm so glad that I read it. What a wonderful, powerful book. I really need to read more by Jose Rizal in the future. I believe there's a sequel to this book that I would really love to read, and yeah, this was just truly amazing. What a highlight of the year. Then at number 3, I have Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Dangarembga. I read Nervous Conditions in December and I haven't spoken about it on this channel yet, and it was so good. It was so good. And although I have put this on this list as my 3rd favourite classic of 2024, I feel like it probably is actually the best classic I read this year. Like, objectively speaking, I think it's probably the best book I read this year. Yeah, objectively speaking, I think it's probably the best book I read this year. I thought it was amazing. I was sort of umming and ahhing about whether to put it on the classics list or the contemporary list because it came out in 1988, and the author is still alive and writing, I believe, or at least I think her most recent book was like 2018. But it was published in the 1980s and it's set in the 1960s and 70s, and I do feel like the historical context is very, very important to it. So I feel like it's definitely a book I would think of as like a modern classic rather than a recent book. I listened to an audiobook and it was just amazing. Dangarembga is an author from Zimbabwe, and Nervous Conditions is a coming-of-age story about a young girl growing up in what is now Zimbabwe, what was then Rhodesia, in the 1960s and 70s, and we follow her efforts to get an education and her complicated friendship with her cousin. And it's a book about gender and money and class and imperialism and colonialism and the inescapable effects of colonialism on the psyche. I kind of don't want to say more than that because part of the power of Nervous Conditions as a book is that for quite a long time, when you're reading the book, the title and the content feel like they're at a disconnect, and then the content and the title get closer together, and you start to understand why the book is called what it is. And I just thought it was amazing. The characterization is incredible. The themes are amazingly done. The writing is fantastic. It's a book that is both intensely powerful and serious, but also has moments of humor. And you watch this girl grow up and you see all of the people around her and you learn more about them. And like a lot of my favorite buildings romance, you know, like David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, yes, it is a book about this girl growing up, but actually it's a book about all the people around her and what she observes about them, and what their lives tell her about the world. It's just fantastic. Like, I just think everyone should read Nervous Conditions, and it was so good. I feel like maybe I should have put this at number 1 on this list, but I do have 2 other wonderful books that I also loved a lot this year to tell you about. But I just think Nervous Conditions is so good. It was so good. Okay, right. At number 2, I have another wonderful book that I also read in December, but I did already talk about it in my sort of international classics goal roundup video last week. But anyway, that's The Blue Castle by L.M. Montgomery, which is a novel from Canada from the 1920s. L.M. Montgomery is most famous for her Anne of Green Gables books. I read Anne of Green Gables a few years ago and enjoyed it, but not as much as I love The Blue Castle. So The Blue Castle is a wonderful novel about 29-year-old Valency, who has what she perceives as quite an empty life. She lives with her mother and she's quite sort of like kept down. She represses herself a lot, and she's 29 years old and everyone around her is saying, oh, you should be married, you should have children, you haven't like ticked off all the milestones that you should have ticked off. And Valency just spends her days sort of making quilts and doing what her mother says, and she's not happy. And then on her 29th birthday, she goes to see the doctor because she's been having a bit of pain with her heart, and she is told that she only has 1 year to live. So Valency decides that if she only has 1 year to live, she's going to really live, and she starts talking back to her family and not just doing what they say. She leaves home, gets a job, and just like changes her life, and makes so many steps to bring herself to happiness that she has never experienced before. And I just loved The Blue Castle. It's so delightful. I should explain the title. The Blue Castle is this sort of like imaginary castle that Valency has in her head, and basically when she gets this diagnosis, she tries to make her own life as happy and joyful as the Blue Castle inside her head. The Blue Castle is such a joyous book. There are so many hilarious, funny moments, especially when Valency starts like contradicting all her older relatives. And it's so funny and joyful and delightful, but also there's so much social criticism about the position of women in the 1920s, and so much more. And I just loved it. I thought Valency was such a wonderful, believable character, and there were so many like fantastic moments within this book, and I just adored it so much, and I know I will read it in the future. Like, it was such a pleasure to read. So I really loved The Blue Castle this year. What a highlight. I really, really recommend it. It was just such an incredible book. But I think the top spots, my favourite classic of the year has to be Iola's Angel by Anthony Trollope. This is a truly fantastic, wonderful novel by Anthony Trollope that was a real comfort read for me, and it was just such an utter pleasure to read. I don't think Iola's Angel is as like good a book objectively as The Blue Castle or Nervous Conditions. Iola's Angel is definitely too long in places. It's a bit repetitive, but I still enjoyed every single second of it, and it was just such an utter pleasure to read. So Iola's Angel, another fantastic Victorian book by one of my favourite Victorian authors. It's about these two sisters, Lucy and Iola, and after the death of their parents, they are separated. One sent to live with one relation, one sent to live with another. Iola goes to the sort of wealthier relations and Lucy to the less wealthy relations, and we follow these two characters and their romantic relationships, as well as their relationships with each other, with their family, and various other characters around them. And a lot of the sort of tension of the book comes from the fact that Lucy is in love with someone who her family disapproves of. Meanwhile, Iola has many suitors who various different relations approve of, but she doesn't want to marry any of them. And there's so much that I loved about Iola's Angel. I feel like it has everything in it that I love about Anthony Trollope, and it was such a comfort read. Like, it was such a pure delight and pleasure to read. I just enjoyed every second of the reading experience, even when it was a bit long, even when Anthony Trollope was going around in circles, as he sometimes does. Like, I just still loved every second of it. And it was one of those Anthony Trollope books that just reminded me why I love Anthony Trollope and why he's one of my absolute favourite authors. Was just such a pure delight of a book. Some of my absolute favourite Anthony Trollope characters come from Isla's Angel. Jonathan Stubbs, just, I loved him. He was wonderful. But there were so many other great characters too. And Isla's Angel, as with many Anthony Trollope books, just has such a fantastic depiction of unrequited love. Anthony Trollope just writes about unrequited love in a way that no other author does, and it's so fantastic and so well done. And I just thought the characterization was so good and the writing was so good, and I just had such a lovely, lovely time with it. And so in terms of like pure enjoyment per word, I guess like Isla's Angel would be top of the year, maybe. Probably even more than the wonderful, fantastic favourite modern books of the year that I spoke about last week. So those are my favourite classics that I read in 2024. Really wonderful books that I would recommend to you all. Do let me know down in the comments, how did your reading go in 2024? Do you have a favourite classic of the year? What was it? Otherwise, thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.